Hello, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Eyes on Southeast Asia, the premier podcast on foreign policy, security, and economic issues in Southeast Asia, brought to you by the foreign policy community of Indonesia. Today, in this episode, we are going to have a discussion on AUKUS with Dr. Rizal Sukma. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS Jakarta. Dr. Rizal was the first Indonesian to ever receive the Nakasone Award, and he was among the 100 top global thinkers in 2009, according to Foreign Policy magazine. He is definitely a foreign policy expert of Indonesia, of international standing, and I had the privilege of going to the same university together at London School of Economics and Political Science. We did our PhD there, and we did it under the tutelage of Professor Michael Leifer as well. Dr. Rizal has become the Indonesian ambassador to the UK, Ireland, and International Maritime Organization from 2016 to 2020. So he's got both feet in think tank circles and also in policy circles, right? And his contribution in the field of international relations and Indonesian foreign policy is undebatable. He contributed to President Joko Widodo's vision, including the global maritime fulcrum, and he's also one of the thinkers behind the ASEAN security community, which later became the ASEAN political security community, where he played a great role in conceiving it. Yeah. Dr. Rizal, welcome to Eyes on Southeast Asia. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're looking good. Yeah, and thank you for being here today. And I'm glad to see some white hair on you. You got more white hair than me.
Yeah, after 4.5 years in London.
Yes. So I would imagine you would get less hair because it's less white hair because such a great post, right? So talking about London, there has been a lot in the news about AUKUS lately. The Australia, UK, US military or defense arrangement that has become in everybody's lips in recent days. Yeah. Were you surprised by it?
Well, I'm not really surprised by it, because unless, you're too obsessed with the normative international relations, you would have noticed, that, in the current power politics dynamics. So I think alliance enhancement or alliance building, I think will be part of that dynamic. And here, we already observe, the growing rivalry between the US and China. And then in my view, this AUKUS is only an extension or the continuation of that, rivalry. So from a realist, perspective, I think, we can expect that, the two great powers would, begin to position themselves, in order to create, a certain primacy, in their relationship. So I'm not really surprised. If you look at the logic, of our power politics.
Okay. The Indonesian Foreign Ministry has issued a 5-point statement in response to the AUKUS, among others saying this is something that we should look at with some caution, and then reminding the spirit of Treaty of Amity and cooperation and so on. What is your thought on the Indonesian government's response?
Well, I think, we are in a kind of difficult, position, because going beyond the statement is also difficult, because I don't see how, we can try to shape the dynamics, of this rivalry between the two great powers. But on the other hand, I think, we can try to find a bit, more realist kind of approach to the issue. So we need to go beyond our expectation that the US and China will not compete, and so on. So we actually should, for example, try to come up with the alternative on how that Indonesia, probably together with ASEAN, can try to moderate this growing rivalry between the two countries. Uh, and I also noticed that there is a lot of concern, in the statement, and also hope. And in my view, this concern probably need to be unpacked. Whether say, for example, one of the concerns that our foreign ministry has mentioned is that this AUKUS will lead to the arm race. But in my view, some sort of arm race is already taking place. Because if you look at these two great powers, so on the one hand, the U.S. probably has come to the conclusion that the China's rapid military rise is no longer I think good for the regions, and also will also upset the balance of power. So that's why the U.S. begin to take the initiative in order to actually sustain the military preponderance of the U.S. and also sustain the U.S. primacy not only at the global level but also at the regional level. Number two, the other concern that Indonesia has expressed, whether this AUKUS agreement or arrangement will have an impact on the NPT. But I think this is also need to be unpacked. The extent to which the NPT will be undermined by this technology sharing agreement between the US, UK, and Australia. The third point, in our position is that we be worried that this is going to undermine the Southeast Asia nuclear weapons free zone. But in my view, the zone fest, as we call it here in the region, has never been, I think, a reality, because the great powers, the nuclear powers, will continue to resist and refuse to actually sign the protocols.
Yeah, on the NPT, my understanding is that all the leaders who announced the AUKUS have stressed that they will do it in a way that will not violate the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Yeah. So, what is you feel your response on that?
Well, of course, I think especially Australia, they has guaranteed that they are not going to acquire nuclear weapons. But of course, I think on the other hand, it is also justifiable, if there are those, who are worried that the nuclear powered submarine, can also, become nuclear weapon submarine, because if you look at the history of or evolution of capability of the US, the UK submarine, it took them only a few years before the SSN became the SSBN. So, within that context, I think more explanation and also more dialogue and discussion is really needed between, especially Australia, with the regional countries, including those countries who already have expressed concerns such as Indonesia and Malaysia.
Yeah, the announcement of AUKUS was mentioned also in the context of Indo-Pacific, right? What do you think is the impact of AUKUS on Indo-Pacific and on the debate regarding Indo-Pacific? As the Chinese and the Russians don't like the term Indo-Pacific. They like the old term Asia-Pacific and so on, and they believe this is something to isolate or contain China. But how do you think AUKUS will be perceived in terms of Indo-Pacific debate here?
Well, Indo-Pacific has always been about the strategic space of engagement. It's always about the emerging geopolitical unit, and a new one at that. It's actually an understanding of the way we look at the space where countries will I think conduct their strategic policies, and also where the international politics of the 21st century will be taking place. So it really reflects that reality. So in my view, the Indo-Pacific is not just the geographical expression, but it's also the strategic expression of a space of engagement within. We can use the Indonesian word for that, the mandala. It's also the Indian word. This is where countries actually interact strategically. the announcement of AUKUS it actually reinforced the notion that this new emerging geopolitical unit, the Indo-Pacific, which combined the two oceans, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, is about geopolitics. It's about security. So I think we need to bring, the other elements back, into this discourse on the Indo-Pacific as a space of engagement of countries, in the region, especially on the economic one. So unfortunately, the AUKUS will continue to reinforce the view that the Indo-Pacific is only the place where is suitable for all the countries to talk only about the security and also geostrategic challenges and issues. So that I think one impact that I can see on how the AUKUS will shape and define the discourse and the discussions about the Indo-Pacific at the moment and also probably for the next few years. But here, I think countries like Indonesia and also other ASEAN countries, can of course try to bring in the other dimension of the Indo-Pacific as the unit for the space of engagement of all the countries in the region. So it should not be allowed to only capture or include the security and geopolitical discussion.
Yeah, well, if we will read the Indonesian Foreign Ministry statement, I think implicit in their statement is the concern that AUKUS would lead to heightened strategic rivalries and competition in the Indo-Pacific. Yeah. How valid is that concern?
Well, the rivalry is already there, so it's an emerging. If I may quote the statement by Ambassador Hafas, in Germany, our ambassador to Germany, the writing is on the wall, so I think that is very clear. So rivalry is there.
What did Hafas say?
He said the writing is on the wall, so you should be able to see it. That is something like AUKUS, might, occur. And then it did occur. And then that's actually, as I mentioned in my article in the Jakarta Post, my argument is that this is a logical consequences of, power politics, of the US-China rivalry. So within that context, I think the rivalry is already taking place. And then, in fact, since, say 10 years ago, we should, focus our attention on how that, we should position ourselves within that emerging strategic rivalry between the two powers. And then, what are the other things that we can do in order to moderate, that rivalry. So I'm surprised that a lot of people are surprised.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But, ASEAN also is surprised, was caught by surprise. How do you think ASEAN should respond to AUKUS? Yeah.
Well, I think it's going to be futile, for anybody, who try to have a common single ASEAN view, with regard, to this. For a number of reasons. Number one, I think since 1967, ASEAN member states have been, I think, characterized by differences with regard to the threat perception. And then that's still true until today, so we don't have a common threat perception. And this is the key, for any unified or common response to any strategic development. So as ASEAN doesn't have that common, threat perception, then of course, it will be futile to try to find a common response to the AUKUS. That's number one. Number two, our strategic orientation, member state strategic orientation also differ from one member to the other. Indonesia has been very strong when it comes to so-called non-aligned position, but unfortunately now we tend to equate the bebas aktif, the free and independent, as if it is neutral, which is actually not. But that's different, I think, topic for a discussion. But so, in my view, ASEAN should just move, beyond this debate whether the AUKUS is good or bad, for the region. But it should come back and focus on number one, how to, make sure that it continues to be relevant. And because ASEAN relevance will depend on the ability, again, to enforce what a lot of people call the ASEAN diplomatic centrality. And that means ASEAN should focus again on finding or reforming or even forming institutions or structures in the region that can actually serve as a platform for great powers to actually try to reconcile the differences if they have, and also try to cooperate on certain issues. ASEAN can do that because it does have political capital already to do that.
Yeah, but don't you think it's a bit ironic though, Pak Rizal, because ASEAN is always insisting on ASEAN centrality, and meanwhile you have AUKUS who talks about the Indo-Pacific, and for ASEAN not to have an opinion, an outlook or perspective on AUKUS, wouldn't that be a bit ironic? Yeah.
Yes, of course, it's an irony because, but it also reflects. I think ASEAN has not done what they promised to do. For example, ASEAN always say it wants to be in the as the primary driving seat, and then try to manage this so-called regional order in the Asia Pacific in the past, but probably now the Indo-Pacific. But for the last, I would say, 10 years, ASEAN has not really actually doing that. Because we in ASEAN believe that norm shaping and norm sharing is enough to actually regulate the behavior of extra regional powers. But one thing that ASEAN member states forget, that this dynamic that regulate the major powers interaction is called the power politics. So power politics is coming back, and then that's on the one hand. On the other hand, ASEAN still thinks that normative response still enough to deal with this return of power politics. You and I really understand because we went to the same school that it's a geopolitics or real power politics cannot be, or it's not enough to address those challenges only from normative approach. We need also to combine it with realist approach. So ASEAN in the past is very good in combining realism on the one hand or power and with norms and institutions. So now is the time for ASEAN to try to combine both power and norms and institutions, and to provide a platform to regulate and moderate the rivalry, which is in my view is also the fact in the region, that you can't actually force the two great powers to cooperate because we're not in the position to shape the dynamic of this interaction between ASEAN and China. But I do believe if ASEAN sit and then try to think about the new arrangement where it can continue to demonstrate that it is in the primary driving seat, then we might have a chance to prevent a worse conflict between these two superpowers.
Yeah, the strongest response to AUKUS has come from China. Do you think China's strong response is justifiable?
Well, I would say it's understandable, because the U.S. is the only power that can undermine, and frustrate China's strategic ambition, whatever that might be. So, and U.S. is the only power that can also undermine the rise of China. And while on the other hand, we know that China really wants to reclaim, its rightful, place, within this emerging new global order. So, in that context, of course, the AUKUS will be seen as an attempt by the U.S., to actually frustrate, that rapid rise, China to become, another superpower. So we, in that context, I would say it's, understandable why China reacted very strongly, and especially, opposing the formation of AUKUS, because it's going to also say within 20 years, it's going to affect how balance of power in this region, actually the shape of the balance of power in this region.
So you don't believe any AUKUS officials who say this is not about China?
It is about China for sure. I mean, policy pronouncement, you can say whatever you want. You can say that, it is not going to affect, it's only cooperation to make the submarine. But, why do you need submarine, if you don't believe that, it's going to serve a certain strategic objective, So the AUKUS is basically, reflects the policy in the, especially in the US for two things. Number one, I think the U.S. has come to the conclusion that they need, to stepping up their attempt to preserve the primacy, in international politics. That's the first objective. The second objective, I think in the Indo-Pacific, the U.S. also doing what they call the offshore balancing, because they also have a lot of allies, Australia is an American ally, so it's nothing new, in the military cooperation between the US and Australia. But this is also part of this offshore balancing, So now, when the US need to preserve its primacy at the global level because of the rapid rise of China, then it's doing it, through this offshore balancing by stepping up the capacity and capability of Australia as one of the U.S. allies. So this complementary also with what the U.S. has done, the Quad, for example. So this is a diplomatic and a strategic part of the U.S. attempt to preserve its primacy, which is also again normal. If one country has become powerful, in the global politics, they might want to preserve it. So the key questions for us in this region, how this attempt by China to become a major powers, a great powers, and the U.S. attempt to preserve its primacy will not be detrimental to other countries' interests. So that's the key question that we need to ask ourselves and then try to find the response to that challenge.
Oh, thank you very much. This is a conversation that I wish I could have for 3 hours because I love hearing your deep insights, Dr. Rizal. Unfortunately, we have to close, and I want to thank you for talking to FPCI, and I look forward to more engaging discussions with you, Dr. Rizal. Thank you very much.